Hiring is a lonely business. Posting jobs, sifting through resumes, interviews with unqualified applicants, being ghosted. What if you could link with dozens of qualified candidates who are ready to work right now with just one connection? We're Express Employment Professionals, your full-service workforce solution. Every day, Express recruits qualified candidates in your area. So when it's time to hire, they have the talent you need ready to go to work. With more than 40 years in the staffing business and more than 860 locally owned and operated offices, Express helps thousands of companies find great people each year. And they can help you, too. Don't go it alone. Go to expresspros.com. One connection, great candidates, problem solved. expresspros.com, the workforce you need when you need them. That's Express Employment Professionals. Find us at expresspros.com.
This episode is brought to you by Hulu. Life's full of little dramas, the kind you don't want, the annoying everyday kind. Hulu has the drama you want. Thrilling dramas like 911, The Handmaid's Tale, and Emmy winner FX's Shogun. Heart-tugging dramas like Grey's Anatomy, Gilmore Girls, and Scandal. And fresh Hulu original dramas like Paradise, Good American Family, and 9 Perfect Strangers. Let's pause the annoying everyday drama and play the drama you want. Hulu, the drama you want.
Many years ago, my local aunt and uncle decided to host an exchange student from Dusseldorf, Germany. His name was Max. At 15 years old, he was just under the official beer drinking age in Germany of 16 years old, but that didn't hinder his excitement when he learned not only that I brew my own beer, but that I happen to have a rather familiar style on tap. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the deliciously historic style known as Altbier is contributor Will Lovell.
It's so funny that the land that we associate with lagers has two of the most popular ales, kind of hybridized ales in the world. And so Altbier is one of my all-time favorite styles to drink. It's super crushable. It's malty. It's all those things that I love in beer. And so I'm so excited to talk about it with you today, Marshall.
Yeah, I agree with you. Altbier is one of those styles that I've loved even before I knew what Altbier really was, largely because when I started drinking, I lived in the Pacific Northwest where Alaskan Amber was insanely popular at the time. And that beer, it is technically, I guess, an alt beer. At least that's what it said on the label back then. So since those days, I've had the opportunity to sample a handful of legit German alt beer, thanks to my friend Max, as well as brew many batches of my own. Suffice to say, I love the style just as much as you will, and I look forward to chatting about it with you today, as well as going over my attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. If you enjoy this show and want to help us to continue producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, which you can do over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Over the years, guests have included myriad well-known figures in homebrewing and craft beer, folks like John Palmer, Gordon Strong, and Vinny Chilurzo, among many others. To be a part of these sessions, all you have to do is make a pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and YouTube pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. You can learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to help us out is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having an awesome YouTube channel chock full of great brewing-related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer, whether you're after a 120-volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240-volt 10-gallon system. Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they've got at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Zach Koslow hit us up with some feedback after listening to last week's episode, Will, where we talked about using ascorbic acid in the mash to mitigate cold side oxidation. Zach said, My dudes, I loved this website. I've loved this website and the show for years. Keep it up. Oh, we will, bud. But this is the first time I felt you guys were a bit ignorant of the science that's out there. Ascorbic acid's advantage for mash usage is as a chelating agent. It'll bind with heavy metal ions like iron and copper present in malt, which would otherwise serve as catalysts for oxidative reactions, i.e. the formation of the reactive oxygen species you mentioned. Is this the end-all be-all? Hell no. But it's just another tiny knob that brewers can turn to squeeze out the most from their beers. It's the exact same mechanism behind the reason brewers add hops to the mash. So first off, Zach, we're doing our best to keep it up. I promise you that we have no plans to not keep it up, and we absolutely appreciate your support as well as your feedback this week. If I didn't make it clear in that episode, I am very far from an expert on the topic of ascorbic acid, and honestly, I think that was probably the first time ever that I said the word out loud, chelating, because I've seen it, I've read it, but I don't know if I've ever actually said it out loud in the way that I did with your feedback. I don't even know if I'm saying it correctly, to be honest. While we do our best to be as knowledgeable as possible about the topics we're discussing, oftentimes it just doesn't cut it. Now, admittedly, our approach has always been a bit more practical in nature, unlike what lab scientists do. So if anything we said on that or any other past episode has been misleading, that certainly was not our intention. So again, thank you for the feedback. What do you think, Will?
Yeah, truth be told, I'm an IT guy. I'm very far from a brewing scientist. Thankfully we have a brewing scientist on the team, but he has different specialties and different things. So to me, this was something that we just heard. We decided to test it out to see if we could find a difference. Interestingly enough, in spite of everything we talked about, it was a significant result. But I'm pretty good at sleuthing through the internet, and in all my Google searches, pretty much everything pointed back to that video we discussed.
Yeah. And
it's very difficult. I didn't find a whole lot of real literature talking about it in the mash. And so if you have those articles, feel free to email them to me. It's just will@brewlosophy.com, and I would love to read through them. I would love to read through any literature. I sleuth through the internet for my day job, and somehow my sleuthing ability just came up short. But then again, I've never said chelating out loud, and so either until just now. And so maybe I just wasn't using the right search terms, which is often the case.
Yeah, there's that kind of in my mind, at least, this issue that we run into as hobbyists who take it maybe a little bit more seriously than other hobbyists. And it's that we run the risk of coming off as know-it-alls. And I think I mentioned this in the last episode. That is absolutely a kind of antithetical to the Brewlosophy way. We don't want to be that way. And hence, I will always take corrective feedback and read it here so that we can set people straight or set the record straight. So Zach, again, appreciate you so much for listening to the show, reading what we put out on the website, and correcting us when we're wrong. If anybody out there feels compelled to do the same, please do. It's not going to upset us. So if you have show feedback, or corrections, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. When we return from this break, our focus will be on Altbier. Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
In terms of beer history, Germany is probably one of the few regions I think of as having one of the richer brewing traditions, the influences of which can be seen in various modern styles today. However, one not so modern German style that has seemed to have stood the test of time is Altbier, the history of which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so Altbier is one of those beer styles that's been around for quite a long time. It was first documented in 1838 by Schumacher Brewery in Dusseldorf, Germany. The word alt means old, so that's why it's called the old beer, because it's using more traditional German methods. Alt, if you ever go through Germany and you're ever trying to like be in a touristy town and you want to find the place you want to go, usually the Altstadt, the old town, is where you're trying to head to, because that's what they use there. So just Altbier just means it's the older style of brewing method used for it. In addition to malt and hops, the original yeast used to make German beer was top fermenting, or what is commonly referred to as ale yeast. So we have this really cool style using older methods, an ale yeast, and so really we're talking about one of the older amber ales out there, which is really exciting.
Well, and I love that you kind of Freudian slipped there to say amber lager, because the thing is Altbier really does have, in my opinion at least, and people can describe their experiences however they like, I suppose, but it really does have a lager-like characteristic, and I think that was very intentional. Like you said, Altbier really came to the scene in 1838, and so we're talking like mid 19th century, and it was developed, it seems, at least from what I could read historically, with some intention to offer drinkers a unique lager-like experience despite being fermented with what we now know as ale yeast, this top fermenting yeast. Well, at the time, you have to remember that in Europe at this time in the mid 19th century, the popularity of pale, bottom fermented lagers was growing rapidly. And I mean, I think a lot of us are very happy that happened. And, we view these nice, pale, crisp lagers, these European lagers, particularly from Germany and the Czech Republic, as being some of the best on earth. Well, you had this group of people in Dusseldorf saying, no, we want to stick to the old ways, but how can we do that? And so they kind of hybridized this style of beer that we now call Altbier. And it's the people who live in Cologne and Dusseldorf, I'm sure, will absolutely disagree with us, but it's not that different from Kolsch. It's kind of a similar impetus for the development of that style as well, both fermented with top fermenting yeast and yet present as more lager-like in character, which I think is cool. The Schumacher Brewery was sure to delineate their traditional bottom fermented lager, which of course they had to make some of that as well, from their top fermented lager, which I think is hilarious. It's kind of an oxymoron, right? That and an oxymoron that we're quite familiar with, I would say, Will, over here at Brewlosophy, because we've done that a lot. We've actually made ales with bottom fermenting lager yeast as well, and it's cool for me at least to think back that these dudes in the mid 19th century were basically what we're doing is nothing new. It actually is rooted in quite a bit of cool history.
Oh, the old question of what is lager? Is it defined by the yeast? Is it defined by the actual lagering? What is it defined by? Or is it just defined by what we define it as and we just call it a lager because that's what it tastes like? So that's pretty cool. But because I totally agree. Alt beer is, I did Freudian slip earlier. Alt beer is an ale, but it does totally have a lot of characteristics of those amber lagers that I also enjoy. But I think it's great. I think it's not really that ironic that Cologne and Dusseldorf have like this kind of rivalry, though, because they really are only 40 kilometers, or what is that in miles? 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles apart. Literally, it's a 20-minute public transit train ride to get from one to the other. And so, and it's kind of great too that, admittedly, they both have kind of these unique yeasts that are associated with them that are just slightly different, but they're both, top fermenting ale yeast. So it's really, really, really cool. I think, honestly, this is one of the great traditions in Germany, is having these two towns so close to one another that are duking it out on who has the better ale in Germany.
Yeah, I told the story of my buddy Max. He first came to Fresno, 10 years ago now. And whenever we go to Europe, he will figure out a way to meet up with us wherever we're at. He and his grandfather actually met up with us in the Czech Republic. And he always brings, he's from Dusseldorf. And so he always brings me local alt beers to try. So I don't remember all the commercial brands that I've been able to sample that he's either sent me or brought to me. And, but he is just a huge fan. And he told me, he goes, it's kind of like water in Dusseldorf. This is just what everybody drinks. And I said, do you ever drink Kolsch? And he gave me this look like, are you kidding me? Like it's a real deal over there. Of course he enjoys Kolsch. He's just saying definitely not in the Altstadt of Dusseldorf. And again, like I said before, it did emerge around the same time as Kolsch. The development of both of these styles was pretty much the same time and again impetus, which I think is really interesting. Of course, Kolsch is much paler in color, but the one thing both of them have in common, or the few things they both have in common, and we'll break down the process here in a minute, but is that they are fermented with ale yeast at somewhat cooler temperatures than you might expect for like an English mild or something. But then they do go through an extended lagering period of roughly 4 to 6 weeks is what I've read. So it is, again, this hybridized style that is, it really seems that they're trying to satiate this desire, for a crisp, clean lager-like beer, but using these older methods. And in my opinion, it really worked out. So according to the BJCP, they provide a description of alt beer as a cold conditioned top fermenting beer from Dusseldorf that has a cleaner and smoother palate than is typical for most ales. Alt refers to the old style of brewing using top fermenting yeast that was common before bottom fermenting lager brewing became popular. I feel like that is everything that we've already said. So.
Exactly. That's all. That's taking it all the way there. And again, it's just such a wonderful, beautiful style. And you're talking about your buddy like giving you samples of it. The one that I was able to get most access to was, I think, the Diebels alt. And there was in Landstuhl, which is close to where I lived when I lived in Germany, there was this castle, and you could go up there to the castle, and they had a little cafe off to the side, and they had a lot of different beers. So you could get Pilsner, you could get a Hefeweizen, but they also had an alt beer. And so it was just so great to just bring back those memories of sitting up there next to a castle, looking over the town of Landstuhl, eating your Jägerschnitzel and drinking your Diebels alt. It's just a wonderful image.
That sounds amazing. I wish I could be in Dusseldorf right now doing that. That sounds amazing. So let's go over some of the more descriptive stuff that the BJCP lays out, at least. And again, you got to remember, the BJCP is an American body, and they are, I believe, genuinely committed to trying to represent these classic styles as closely as possible, based on historical literature about these styles, as well as experiences consuming them. So alt beer, appearance-wise, should be amber to deep copper in color, stopping short of brown. Bronze orange is the most common color. Brilliant clarity with a thick, creamy, and long-lasting off-white foam, cap of foam. And that matches up exactly with the commercial examples that I've had that have come from Dusseldorf.
Right, and that when you get that nice bronzy kind of colored alt beer, and you just that thick cap of foam, and then you look through it, you just kind of see that little hint of light shining through because it is clear. It has been lagered enough to get that clarity. It is just a beautiful sight, and you know that you're in for a good time.
Oh, yes. And how about the aroma? What do you expect from a good alt beer in terms of the smell?
So aroma, you're looking for moderate to moderately high malty and rich grainy characteristics like baked bread or toasted crust. You shouldn't have any dark roast or chocolate notes necessarily. Moderate to low spicy, peppery, or floral hop aroma is acceptable. It complements but doesn't dominate the malt. Very clean fermentation, and medium to low esters is optional.
I feel like whenever a beer is fermented with a top fermenting ale yeast, the BJCP at least includes some sort of an optional ester thing in there. I wouldn't expect to. They say that with Kolsch as well. And I remember when I was first learning about styles back in the early 2010s. I remember having Kolsch's, commercial Kolsch's next to me, commercial alt beers, and tasting them, going, I'm not picking up ester profile whatsoever. So my mind, if I'm tasting what I know to be at least esters, I'm kind of thinking something's a little off here, because again, these are cooler fermented ales, so you would expect some suppression of esters, as well as lagered. So anyways, your mileage may vary. If you make a alt beer with esters, I'm sure it's fine. In terms of flavor, it's basically just follows the aroma. You would expect an assertive medium to high hop bitterness that balances the malt richness, and that is my understanding is that piece of it is truly just to balance the richness of the malt, because of the fact that it is, you're using different malts that are going to contribute more of that kind of sweetness. So a nice bitterness to balance it is a good thing. It's going to finish medium dry with a grainy, bitter, malty rich aftertaste that can leave a nutty or bittersweet impression and last quite a while. No roast, chocolate, or harshness. Medium to low spicy, peppery, floral hop flavor. Again, clean fermentation profile with light fruity esters being completely fine. And they note that it, especially dark fruit esters, to me, that would come from, maybe darker crystal malts or something that you're using in a style like this. But again, and then a light minerally character is optional as well.
Yeah, and I would think in this style, again, because you have so much malt and sort of that hop bitterness going on, that picking out esters would be kind of difficult, honestly.
Exactly.
There's so much there that the esters would be kind of a background, bassist versus like anything that comes to the front. But the mouthfeel, what we'd expect from the mouthfeel would be a medium body with a smooth texture, medium to medium high carbonation, and no to low astringency. And low astringency is too much in my opinion, but
Amen.
That's just
I wonder if the astringency comment is just, again, kind of like, hey, look, you're going to be using some darker grains in this, so if you get a little bit of that, darker grain astringency or something, I would agree with you that if there's astringency in it, I'm probably wondering what happened. It may very well also be just that thing where you can't really distinguish between bitterness and astringency, and so if it's a little bit astringent, if that's what you think, then you're good to go. Who knows? In terms of the vital stats, an alt beer should start, according to the BJCP, anywhere between 1044 and 1052 OG, finishing at 1008 to 1014 FG for an ABV of 4.3 to 5.5%. That is like right in my wheelhouse. I love that. In terms of bitterness, you're looking for 25 to 50 IBU with a color of 9 to 17 SRM. All of that adds up with every alt beer I've ever made. I'm assuming that it also aligns with most of the alt beer you've consumed when living in Germany, Will.
Yeah, so that 9 to 17 is kind of, I couldn't remember quite the SRM until we started reviewing this for the show again, because I haven't looked at an alt beer recipe in a minute, but that 9 to 17 SRM, like that is a pretty significantly broad range, but that's right there with it. I think that's a pretty great spot for it to be, and that kind of covers that, but again, I kind of think that more of that bronze color, a little bit more than some of the others, but all of that looks fantastic. Give me a nice 4.5% bronze colored amber ale, and I'll crush it all day.
Yeah, I know. Amber ale that tastes like an amber lager.
Exactly.
So in terms of the characteristic ingredients and considerations when designing a classically made version of alt beer, you're looking primarily at Pilsner malt, maybe sprinkle in some Munich malt and a small amount of medium crystal malt. Some chocolate or black malts are fine, so long as you're not using enough to impart a roasted or chocolate flavor to the beer. You really want to avoid that. You can also use some wheat, and I believe it was in the BJCP guidelines that some alt beer breweries in Germany are actually using like roasted wheat to get that color in their alt beer, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah, I would think probably instead of Crystal, you'd probably use one of the German brands that's using the Cara and Carafa, for your crystal and your black malts. But I honestly, just that little hint of maybe even some Cara Munich in there somewhere. But anyways, it's such a great malt bill. It's so simple. There's not a lot to it. It's just going to give you that nice, rich malty backbone that you're looking for this beer. So I'm all for it. I'm here for it. It sounds great. For hops, we're going to be looking at Spalt hops are traditional, but you can use other classic German or Czech varieties that are appropriate. Maybe Noble-esque hop varieties out there, maybe like Perle or something like that.
Yeah, if I'm designing, I've made so much alt beer in my day. In fact, one of the beers that I've won a first place in a local BJCP competition with was an alt beer, and I believe the recipe for that is shared with our patrons on the website, and it's a great one. I've also made Kolsch using basically the same recipe without the darker grains, and so it's kind of a neat style that you can really mess around with. I always go with whatever noble hop I have on hand, and I'm usually mixing in, a little bit of Magnum or something just to get a clean bitterness. Because again, to me, it's very important to have that nice balance of bitter with the malty. And so again, my favorite hop to use for any style like this is Tettnanger, but I've used Spalt, I've used Hallertau Mittelfrüh, I've used Perle, like you said. They all work very well for this style. In terms of fermentation, the yeast that you're going to use, the yeast that you can use at least, or the ones that are the labs put out specifically for this style, would be something like White Labs WLP 036 Dusseldorf Alt, Imperial Yeast GO2 Kaiser, Y Yeast 1007 German Ale. Or you can just go with any old Kolsch yeast as well. I mean, again, the idea is that you're using what is, biologically a ale yeast, a top fermenting strain, but fermenting it slightly cooler than you might a traditional ale, and then pushing it through a lagering phase. And so, if you don't have access to alt beer or Kolsch yeast, get some Chico yeast, ferment it a little bit cooler. You're still going to make an alt beer by technical standards, because it is a top fermenting yeast.
I would even go so far and say that if you did 3470 warm, you could probably get away with it. It would be frowned upon by many circles, but just don't tell them; they won't know the difference. That's
when have we cared about being frowned upon, Will?
I like to let them taste it, tell me how good it is, and then I like to be frowned upon after the fact. That's what I like to do. But of these, it's Kaiser is probably my favorite yeast to use for alt beer. That's the one I used the last time I made an alt beer, and I really enjoyed that one, and that beer seemed to do pretty well in competitions. I even like to use Kaiser when I'm making Kolsch, so don't tell the people from Cologne that, because they might get a little upset with me. But I'm a really big fan of GO2 Kaiser, and so to me that would be probably where I would go with this, and also with Kolsch. So, but all those are great. And again, I would probably use 3470 in a pinch. I wouldn't have any problem with it, or even some of those new hybrid strains like Nova Lager might work out, because again, that's kind of a hybrid ale lager, when that seems to be something that maybe not traditional would fit the bill of this tradition of trying to make an ale that's more lager-esque.
Yeah, I've done it before, dude. I told you I've made so much alt beer. The thing is, if you look at my recipe for a continental amber lager, a European amber lager, and you put it next to my alt beer recipe, they're not that different. In fact, probably the biggest difference is the yeast, because my lager has lager yeast, my ale is made, my alt beer is made with ale yeast. But if you're getting the same characteristic overall, if I were to make an alt beer and ferment it with 3470, what's to stop me just from calling it a European amber lager? So call it what you want. If your intention is there, then just call it whatever you intended it to be. Who cares? I do think, though, that the history behind alt beer, and Kolsch for that matter, is cool enough to kind of honor it, and that's my personal opinion. It is just beer after all, but it's kind of cool to know, hey, I did it the traditional or the alt way, the old way, and part of that is going to come into play as we talk about the brewing process, though, which, again, not terribly different than other German lager styles of beer, but certainly, I think, specific to the region of Germany, at least, with how commonly these things are used. In terms of water chemistry, you're looking for a balanced to slightly higher chloride to sulfite ratio or sulfate ratio to emphasize the maltiness. Again, this is a style, you're not looking for, porter style malt character, but to kind of lean into that malt and really emphasize the malt flavor and that warmness that a darker malt can bring to the table. A little bit more chloride to sulfate is probably where you're going to go. My understanding is Dusseldorf, the water that they have there municipally, is actually pretty, soft and not very characteristic. It doesn't have much higher chloride than it does sulfate or anything like that.
Yeah, I would go with a balanced profile if I was going to try to stick to tradition, just to kind of keep things in balance, as it were. I know that's probably not the appropriate way. I know we like extremes in our culture, but yes, a nice balanced profile sounds great. Mashing, things get really interesting because you would traditionally want to do kind of a step mash to ensure maximal attenuation. So you'd want to do your acid rest at about 95 to 113 Fahrenheit, which is 35 to 45 degrees C. Protein rest is about 113 to 131 Fahrenheit, which is 45 to 55 degrees C. And then a beta amylase rest at 140 to 150 Fahrenheit or 66 C. And then an alpha amylase rest just to make sure we drive it all home at 160 to 170 Fahrenheit or 71 to 77 C. And so, pretty much you're doing all that as this very nice step mash. And so what are we in on the mash now? Like an hour and a half, 2 hours now?
Well, my understanding is each one of these steps, you would hold it for 15 to 20 minutes. So yeah, you're looking, and then you don't count the time it takes to heat it up to the warmer temperature. The next step, you could probably get away with a decoction, which I'm sure is the way they had to do it in the early days of Altbier, because that was the way that things were done in Germany at the time, German brewing. Don't forget, we have to add the mash out step as well. So technically this could be a 5-step mash if you're hitting each one of those steps. Pretty convoluted, but again, commonly done in Germany. And there are people to this day who are wholly convinced that if you don't do this, you're going to miss out on some juju that Altbier has to offer. So that is, again, the very traditional way is to employ a step mash. You then take that sweet wort, throw it in a kettle and boil it for at least 90 minutes. Again, you're using the biggest proportion of malt that's being used is this lowly kilned Pilsner malt, which runs the risk of imparting your beer with nasty dimethyl sulfide or DMS. We don't want that. And so in order to get rid of that, you're going to do an extended boil, nice, vigorous extended boil. Also, you want to get that nice assertive bitterness, which you're able to do with less hops overall if you're boiling longer, because you can throw them into the boil a bit earlier.
Right. And hops are one of the more expensive ingredients in this process, aside from yeast. And, so by doing that 90-minute boil, you're going to be able to use fewer hops to get that same bitterness that you're trying to do to back up this malt backbone, which is really what you're trying to do. And then again, with these undermodified malts that they would have traditionally used in the old days, a 90-minute boil to get rid of that DMS makes a whole lot of sense to me. So again, to honor the alt beer in the old ways, you would have to do this. But once the boil's over, you want to chill it very quickly, as quick and as cold as you can to ensure a good cold break, and then rack as little trub to the fermenter as humanly possible, because we don't want any of that nasty stuff getting over.
No, man, it'll ruin the beer. And so you're leaving as much trub behind as possible. Now you've got this nice, clear wort that you're ready to ferment. You're going to chill it down to anywhere between 55 and 66 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the internet. That's 13 to 19 C. And pitch your yeast, again, kind of like with lager yeast. You're going to pitch a nice, healthy amount of yeast, propagate it if you need to, pitch multiple packs if that's the case. This beer, when it gets done fermenting, should be brilliantly clear, which is traditionally achieved through an extended lagering process. I think most people understand this process. As soon as the beer is completely done fermenting, you're going to drop it down, cold crash it, if you want to call it that, and hold it at, you could batch, crash it or lager it in the fermenter, or you can rack it to a lagering tank if you want. But the key is letting it sit for a minimum, what I read online is a minimum of 4 weeks, to allow this lagering process to clear the beer and for the beer to mature in the way that we want beer to mature in time, I suppose.
Yeah, that sounds well and good, but as you know, I'm not the most patient person, so I might cheat a little bit and maybe use some gelatin fining just to kind of get it cranked out a little bit faster. I understand the
blasphemy, I say, Will. Blasphemy.
I know, but it's so delicious. Why do I want to wait? It's too hard. Now when it comes to packaging, it can be naturally conditioned or forced carbonated. I would imagine way back in the day they would probably spoon it and get it carbonated that way. Existing Altbier breweries and Dual-Force serve it from the cask, so that seems to make sense to me. You get about 2.5 to 3.1 volumes of CO2. It's super carbonated. I think soda hovers at around 3.1 volumes of CO2. So this is a very heavily carbonated beer, and it should be. And so part of that bitterness you're getting in the finish, to me, is that carbonic bite you're getting from all this CO2.
Yeah, I'll tell you, man, 3.1 volumes of CO2. I can almost assure you that I have never had an alt beer with that much carbonation. That is like opening a can of Coke. And just that fizz, right when you crack it open, and then the experience on the palate would be quite interesting. I'd love to try one. I'm just pretty sure that most of mine are closer to that 2.5 to 2.8 volumes, which I think is perfect. Again, you want this to be a crisp, refreshing, almost lager-like experience when you're drinking it. What to look for in a good example of this style: you want a notably malty without being sweet, balanced by a relatively assertive bitterness, but with lower hop character. You're not looking for, this is not a hoppy American style of beer. This is more malt, focused, but balanced by that bitterness. The fermentation profile should be 99% clean. Maybe a touch of esters is appropriate there. But overall, just dry, crisp, and drinkable.
Yeah, to me, I think they have bitterness in there, which is a little bit misleading because it's not really a bitter beer at all. It's just literally just having enough. Because when I think of alt beer, I'm thinking like malty goodness. But the reality is, the bitterness is just there to take out that sweetness, to make sure that you have a nice balanced beer, that the malt and the bitterness are just living in unison with one another, so that you can just keep on crushing it all afternoon long.
Oh, man, you're making me thirsty. You mentioned Diebel's Alt as being one that you really enjoyed when you lived in Germany. Other notable examples, commercially speaking at least, include Schumacher Alt, which is, I believe, the original. They're the ones who defined the style. But then also Bolton Alt. And if you're looking for something that's easier here in the United States to get your hands on, go grab some Alaskan Amber. I just Googled it again, and sure enough, it is still technically viewed as being an alt beer style, obviously using some American ingredients and techniques, but I think it does a good job of representing that. Maybe a little bit more sweet than I would experience, or than I have experienced in German examples, but a good one nonetheless. Now, judging by the number of batches of alt beer I've brewed over the years, it's safe to say I'm a huge fan. There's just something about the melding of that malty, bitter, and crisp drinkability that makes me love this style. While the vast majority of alt beer I've brewed were done using more or less standard methods, I did employ our short and shoddy approach for a batch I made during the COVID pandemic. Those results when we're back from this break. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As unique and fun as its history is, Altbier is one of those styles I feel could really easily be confused for something else, though in my opinion, it does possess certain qualities that do distinguish it from other beer styles. Now, given it's a sort of mock lager fermented with ale yeast, something we're quite familiar with here at Brewlosophy, I figured it was an excellent candidate for short and shoddy, so I designed a recipe during the COVID pandemic because I love this style as much as I do, and I wanted to see what I could get away with by cutting a bunch of corners, we'll say. So this was a full volume 5-gallon or 19-liter electric brew in a bag batch. I did it on my SS Brewtech 1V 240 volt system, which is seriously going to reduce the amount of time it takes for boiling and heating up. So that's a good thing. I started this batch at 1:19 p.m. one afternoon by collecting the full volume of filtered tap water, and then I added an unmeasured amount of gypsum in hopes of achieving a perceptibly crisp beer. So right off the bat, I'm leaning into something a little bit different than what you might expect in a commercially brewed alt beer, at least classically so, by upping the sulfate to chloride ratio as opposed to doing the opposite. I wanted this to have much more crispness than I did leaning into that malty thing.
Yeah, I have to say, you've described your water as being very soft and nice water, which seems to line up with a lot of like what Dusseldorf would already have. So the fact that you're adding gypsum is already kind of tilting away from that balanced to favoring chloride kind of thing, and you're already pushing way over to the other side. So we're already starting it off with a really great start of unmeasured amounts of gypsum. So way to go, Marshall. We're going shoddy enough.
Yep, I'm just throwing it to the wind, man, all of it. And for the recipe for this batch, I relied on, like I said, alt beer is one of those styles that I've made quite a bit of over the years. It's just something I love. I've done different tweaks on it, but for the most part, my recipe has, at least the grain bill has been more or less similar. In this case, we're looking at 65% Pilsner malt, 26% Munich malt, which is actually a bit more than I would use in a typical alt beer. I think the reason I went with that is because I had so much on hand. So I bumped it up and I reduced some of the other malts. In this case, that was 8% medium UK crystal malt and then 1% roasted barley. What do you think about that malt bill?
Well, what you didn't include as well, because I'm looking at the recipe on the website as well, is that you're not only using Pilsner malt, but you're using like Mecca grade Pelton Pilsner malt and Mecca grade Betolius Munich malt. So you're even like veering further. You're not even using continental malts here. And then when you do finally get over to more of the continental malts, you're not using Carafa or Cara Munich. You're over here using some UK crystal and UK roasted barley. And roasted barley, I mean, you can use it, but come on, man, Carafa, it's just right there. Why not?
I had Carafa too, in my brewery. It's short and shoddy. I was like, what can we get away with? And I'll be honest, at 1%, you're not going to taste the roasted barley, but you are going to see it. And that was my idea, is to just ensure that I had that nice, little bit of hint of darkness there in the beer. So when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and stirred to incorporate. Before I checked to make sure it was at my target mash temperature of 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 C. This was a single infusion mash. Ain't nobody got time for no step mash in the Brewlosophy Brewery here in Fresno, California. What say you, Will, about my going with a single infusion on this one?
Well, since I read off the entire 5-step mash earlier, I was exhausted after reading that, so I don't blame you for brevity here. Also, like, you're using pretty highly modified malts. You're not way back in the alt days, as it were. So doing a single infusion mash seems to be a fair compromise with modern malting.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason that even commercial breweries are opting for single infusion mashes now is that it's just simpler, and the science behind malting has come so far that now our malts are, quote, hotter than they used to be. They're not under modified; they're insanely well modified, and so the necessity of a step mash, that was a process that was developed to encourage the most conversion of starches to fermentable sugars. We don't need to do that anymore these days. And I know that there are people out there who swear that a step mash will contribute something meaningful organoleptically speaking. I don't believe that. We haven't done a single experiment on step mashes that has returned, that I can recall, a notably significant result. So for me, this wasn't actually a big sacrifice by skipping the step mash, but it was different than the way it would traditionally be made. So pointing it out because this is short and shoddy. I left the mash alone, again, single infusion, for just 30 short minutes, after which the wort was transferred to a kettle and boiled for only 25 minutes. I added 30 grams of Tettnang plus 15 grams of Magnum at that 25-minute mark. I believe I might have thrown them in the bottom of the kettle before, or into the wort before it actually reached a boil as well. I forget about that. But then with 5 minutes left in the boil, I added another 15 grams of Tettnang just for aroma and flavor. What do you think? That's not Spalt, but it is traditional German hops.
One of the best alt beers I've ever made was with Tettnang and Magnum, so I have no questions here about how good that combination is for an alt beer. I think you could also gotten away with Perle, Hersbruck, even some German-grown Northern Brewer. I think you've gotten away with a lot of different things here, but I think Magnum and Tettnang are a great combo. And truth be told, I'm not the biggest fan of Spalt. So I think I would have gone a similar road here as well.
Yeah, of all the German Noblesque hops, Spalt's probably my least favorite. Not because it's bad, it's because it's just so plain to me. Tettnang was without a doubt my favorite. I love the floral thing it brings to the show, along with that kind of hint of spiciness. I don't think the hopping here is technically out of bounds. I do think that boiling for just 25 minutes after a tiny little 30-minute mash step is pretty notable. So keep that in mind. We might expect to have DMS, maybe some diacetyl, maybe poor conversion, low OG, all that kind of stuff because of those two steps that I cut corners on. So when the 25-minute boil was complete, I chilled the wort as quickly as I could. I used an immersion chiller, which at the time I was able to get it down to 74 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 23 degrees C, at which point I transferred that wort to a sanitized fermentation vessel and took a refractometer reading that showed it was at 1052 OG. I mean, spot on, in my opinion, for an excellent alt beer, towards the higher end of what the BJCP lists, but I'm cool with that. In this case, to me, a little bit unusual. I got 66% brew house efficiency. When I'm doing standard brewing, a typical 1 hour mash with a 1 hour boil, I get about 73%. So this wasn't even that big of a hit. 7% brew house efficiency hit. Bigger beers, I tend to get, when I'm doing short and shoddy, I tend to get down in the high 50% range. 66% I was really pleased with.
Yeah, that 1052 OG is spot on. It's right there at the top of the BJCP range. So you just nailed it, honestly. But 66%, I would be really happy with that in a 30-minute mash and 25-minute boil. That's pretty ridiculous and pretty awesome. But let's figure out how it tastes before we start patting you on the back too hard, Marshall.
Well, so here's the thing. I at this point in the process, I did not chill the wort down to pitching temperature or anything like that. It was sitting at 74 F or 23 C, and I opened up a pouch of Imperial Yeast GO2 Kaiser, which is the kind of classic alt beer strain that Imperial Yeast offers, and I pitched it right into that warm wort. I didn't prop up a starter. I didn't pitch two pouches. It was just that single pouch, so arguably an underpitch. But that wort was still pretty warm. So again, another short and shoddy aspect to this batch of beer there. I did then put that a beer at this point, because there was yeast in it, into a fermentation chamber. This was before I had I bought my glycol chiller, and I controlled it to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which, according to, again, information I found online, is at the higher end of what alt beer is typically fermented at, even with a top fermenting ale yeast. But I do wish, after we talked about in the last segment, I do wish I would have gone with something different than Kaiser. Now that I look back on it, I wish I would have just pitched, some Imperial Yeast Global, L13 Global, or Harvest, or a real lager yeast, but fermented at warm. Either way, I went with the kind of classic yeast strain here.
I mean, you could even go with Dieter and just upset people from Dusseldorf altogether. You could have really been a heretic there, but you went the safe bet. But I don't blame you. I think Kaiser is a fantastic yeast. I would be hard pressed not to use Kaiser in an alt beer just because of how good it is. Now, the one thing here, though, is you pitched it at 74F. You probably should have dropped it down to that 66F temp before you pitched your yeast. That would have been the more old school alt way of doing it there, Marshall.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that there are other things that are, I guess, potential problems that you'll read about online, or that people at your homebrew club will tell you about from pitching too warm. Fusel alcohols, the production of esters, because that is where it's during those initial stages of fermentation where those types of things are created. And in this case, I didn't do that. I went with the underpitch into warmer wort than most people would recommend. But then there's also the idea that pitching warm will kind of recreate what would happen if you were to make a starter. You're getting that yeast ready to go. It might even propagate a little bit or something before, or at the very least, you're going to have a more vital yeast by the time they actually start working on fermenting that wort. So I don't know. There's some argument to be had that maybe pitching a little bit warm isn't as detrimental as people have claimed. But in this case, if you're going to Dusseldorf, you're not going to see that happening. So this does go against the tradition. At this point, I took a look at my watch. It was 3:21 p.m. for a total brew day time of just 2 hours and 2 minutes. If you add in the time it took me to clean up, let's just call it 2 hours and 20 minutes. And even then, that is such a short brew day compared to what your traditional alt beer brew day might have looked like.
Man, you smoked through that brew day. I always think it's great when you can kind of shave off some time. I know, like myself, you have a family, and trying to get those hours back that you can go spend with your kids is always crucial. So a 2 hour and 2 minute brew day to get some potentially delicious alt beer is always great. And also, I'm looking at your photos here, and I just want to comment that this must have been a while ago that you wrote this article, because I'm seeing pinlock kegs in there. I'm seeing a jumper from a ball lock to pinlock connectors. So if anyone wants to see some fun pinlock action, if you're really into that, you can go get your kicks by looking at this alt beer article on the Brewlosophy website.
Like I said, it was during COVID, which is going to come into play here in a minute when we go over the data. We'll talk about that in a sec. But yes, so 2 hours and 2 minute brew day. I mean, my kids, they weren't in school at the time because it was COVID, but usually that would leave me more than enough time to brew a batch, clean it up, get everything in order, and while also dropping and picking up my kids from school. So I think that's pretty rad, but only if it doesn't ruin the beer. So with signs of fermentation complete, basically a couple weeks later, I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer was at 1009 FG. So there's that attenuation, boy. I do wonder what would have happened if I had done a step mash. Would I have driven that attenuation even more? Would it have gone down to 1006 or something? I'm glad it didn't, because the beer was already, as it stands, it was at 5.7% ABV.
Ooh, that's kind of getting on the boozy side for this particular style of beer. And so I'm, also if you would have maybe mashed a little higher this one time just to keep it from creeping down so low. I know it's supposed to be a dry finishing beer, but it's also malty, and you kind of want to not necessarily get too boozy. Otherwise, it's not really a daytime crusher. It's a nighttime sleep medicine.
Yeah. I was not expecting it to attenuate as well as it did. Maybe it's that Kaiser yeast. I could have gone up to 154 Fahrenheit for the mash or something, but I wasn't complaining. 5.7 during COVID, that was money. So at this point, I cold crashed the beer to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.5 Celsius, left it alone overnight, and then rather than doing this extended lagering period, I hit it with gelatin like you mentioned you would probably do. Now, this is absolutely blasphemy in the tradition of German brewing. You're not going to be throwing in, powdered, cow bones into your beer to get it to clear up. That's more of an English thing, I suppose.
Water, hops, malt yeast, and powdered cow bone. That part's not in the that's not in the Reinheitsgebot there, Marshall. Way to fail.
I know. Well, we're changing the world here. No, but we have regularly referred to gelatin as powdered time, and I still view it as such. And so I was going to utilize this understanding and my experiences to expedite the process of making this beer ready to drink. And so I did just that. I added the gelatin. I let the beer hang out for another 3 days in the fermentation vessel with the gelatin at 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.5 C before transferring it I force transferred it using CO2. I don't want to oxidized beer. I think that's silly. But I force transferred it to a CO2 purged keg. And I also, by the way, used I don't want to get too much into this because people will ask questions, but I used my rudimentary CO2 capture rig where from the fermentation vessel, I had a line going over to a keg that was filled with sanitizer. And then that goes into the gas post. And then the liquid outpost goes into another keg so that the the CO2 that's produced during fermentation pushes the liquid out of the first or the primary keg into the secondary keg. And now you've got a nicely CO2 purged keg, but it's with CO2 that was naturally produced during fermentation rather than from a tank. So you save a little bit of money. Plus, there are people out there who will are convinced that if you do that, then you're not contributing any flavors because it's the CO2 has the flavors of the beer you fermented and all that stuff. So again, I don't think that's necessarily a shoddy approach, but I think it's pretty cool that it's all kind of contained within the beer itself. So that filled keg was placed in my Keyser where it was burst carbonated overnight. I usually do 50 PSI, anywhere between 50 and 60 PSI for 12 to 15 hours before reducing that gas to serving pressure. And then I just let it condition for a whopping 4 days before evaluation. What are your thoughts at this point on my packaging and conditioning process?
So your packaging, I think, is spot on. You try to eliminate as much oxygen as humanly possible. We've said it 100 times before. The idea isn't to make bad beer; it's just to make good beer as fast as we can, cutting a few corners. And oxygen will 100% ruin your beer. So let's not go there. Just kind of like not using sanitizer will probably ruin your beer. So I think you turned it around at a screaming pace. You followed the Marshall Reinheitsgebot quote that includes powdered cowbone, and here we are. And I'm still looking at these pictures. I'm missing my Pinlock days. I remember how easy those Pinlock keg quick disconnects were to get on and off those posts versus wrestling with these stupid ball locks. Why did we adopt that one? I don't understand.
I don't know.
It's the most annoying thing in the world, but that's what we did. But I think, honestly, you turned it around. You had a 2-hour brew day. You had a quick turnaround on your beer, and I think so far we're setting up for what could be an amazing beer. But let's find out your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and just a note again, the short and shoddy thing. We don't go too much into this that often, so I might as well give it a little bit of attention here. Like you said, our intention is to make the best beer possible while cutting as many corners as we can. If we know something is, objectively detrimental to beer, we're not going to employ that. I had somebody, when I first started this series, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, somebody reached out and was like, that's not short and shoddy. You should be fermenting in a dirty fermentation vessel that you forgot to wash after the prior batch, and, pitching 5-year-old yeast that set out on your workbench for, in the summers. And I'm like, no, that's stupid and shoddy. We're doing short and shoddy here. The idea, again, being to make the best beer possible. We want it to be as close to what the BJCP describes it as, at least, as possible, while, again, cutting these corners. So now that that's out of the way, another disclaimer: this batch was brewed during the COVID pandemic, during a time where we were unable to collect data from blind tasters. So for better or for worse, all we've got are the impressions of yours truly here. So make of that what you will. I do try to approach my personal beer evaluations from the most equivocal and objective perspective possible, but there is absolutely no way any human being has the capacity to suspend bias. You can be aware that you're biased, but you can't just pause it. And so keep that in mind as I'm going through my impressions here. We also do tend to be our own worst critics, and I absolutely fall into that camp. I'll have a beer on tap that I brewed that I'm like, there's just this and this wrong with it. But, most people who come over are saying, this is excellent, good job, whatever. So I'm hopefully that kind of balanced my bias a little bit. In terms of the appearance, you've got the picture in front of you now, Will. I described it as having a gorgeous deep amber color with a creamy cap of sticky white foam that left beautiful lacing on the glass. There was minimal chill haze that faded completely after about 5 minutes in the glass. Now, chill haze is one of those things that is not necessarily known for being taken out by gelatin because it is proteinaceous, I guess, in nature. And so it was very slight, in my opinion. Maybe other people would view it differently, but to me, this beer looks like an alt beer. Yeah,
there's a touch of maybe, you could call it that homebrew haze, but it's homebrew clear, I guess. And so it's like but it still has that lovely, nice copper kind of color coming through with the sunshine. That cap of foam looks beautiful. I mean, it looks like the kind of beer that I would like to crush on after a day like today, where it's nice and sunny outside, that I can go sit out there and just crush a delicious amber ale all day. So yeah, it looks great to me.
Did you just refer to my alt beer as an amber ale?
I did.
It kind of is, though. That's the thing.
And it is an amber ale. I'm not wrong.
No, it's an amber colored, cooler fermented lagered amber ale. So in terms of the aroma, I noted it as having toasty notes up front and center, reminiscent of like white bread toasted just to the point of being burnt. Behind that toast, I perceived hints of sweet wet hay and what I would describe as kind of a generic malt aroma. The floral characteristics of the Tettnanger hops also came came through, though it was not so assertive as to be distracting. I didn't notice, or I noticed nothing I would specify as being from the yeast or fermentation in general, which again, if I were to taste like a fruity thing, my brain would probably automatically attach it to the hops and not esters, but again, maybe there were some there that I just didn't detect.
So the thing here that kind of strikes out to me is you said to the point of being burnt, and the only reason I bring that up is because that roast chocolate character is not supposed to quite be there, but you said just to the point of, so maybe you were just shy of that, and so I was going to see if you could speak a little bit around how burnt was it, or was it just shy of that to where you think it was within guidelines?
Listen, Will, I don't think the roasted barley is what I was detecting. What I was referring to more than anything was that really rich Maillard malty flavor that you can get from, say, something like I don't know if you've ever used Special B, but to me that in parts, if you don't use a lot of it in a Belgian ale, and if you've ever used it in a clean fermented beer that's maybe not Trappist or whatever, you get this interesting kind of like borderline caramel, but not really. It's not burnt though. It's not roasted. It's not coffee or chocolate. It's just this kind of like on the edge of toast and burnt toast. I don't know how else to describe it.
I think I know what you're talking about. Dick Wallace, who lives here locally in San Antonio, has made some really wild beers with Special B, things that I would never think to use Special B in. And he has kind of that, I can see where you call it like almost burnt toast kind of flavor.
Yeah.
And so I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And people are going to hear Special B and be like, no, that's raisin and prune. Yes, absolutely. If you use more than 1%, more than what I'm talking about. To me, that's what I got from this beer, which I do think is in part a function of the Mecca grade Metolius, Munich style malt. And in terms of flavor, in fact, similar to other beers I've brewed with that malt, the Metolius, I did perceive this kind of pleasant graham crackery flavor in this alt beer with that hint. And graham cracker to me is kind of like a toasted bread flavor with some sweetness worked into it. And to me, it worked really well with that small touch of caramel malt and those, that little bit of toasty, roasty thing that I got from this beer. Curiously, I consistently detected a more hop spiciness, subtle as it was, and less floral in the flavor than I did in the aroma. And this is just a function, I think, of the maltiness of the beer that kind of may have coincided with or melded with any of those more subtle kind of Tettnanger floral characteristics. So to me, that spicy thing came out a bit more. A more bready flavor lingered on my palate in a way that was quite enjoyable. I enjoyed the way it stuck around. And again, that kind of jibes with what the BJCP says, that this aftertaste might linger for a bit longer than in, say, a pale lager or a Kolsch, something like that. I didn't detect any off flavors in this beer at all.
That graham cracker flavor that you're describing just sounds like it would be absolutely amazing in this style. As far as the spiciness, I tend to associate Tettnanger a little more with spicy than floral, just the way I perceive it. And so I'm not surprised that you kind of lost the floral flavor component. To me, I think the Tettnanger kind of is more assertive in that kind of spiciness area. So that's not really surprising me at all. But so far, I'm getting kind of jealous of you being in lockdown, being stuck with 5 gallons of this. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think everybody had their kind of like lockdown group of friends, and ours was obviously Tim and Michelle, because we were neighbors at the time. And so he came over and helped me plow through this 5 gallons pretty quickly. In terms of mouthfeel, despite the finishing gravity being as low as it was and how attenuated this beer was, it did still possess what I described as a medium light body that maintained an element of crispness without being thin or watery. While the aftertaste did linger a bit, like I mentioned before, I didn't perceive any unpleasant stickiness that you can get with maltier beers. And so that was a good thing. I wouldn't describe the bitterness as being too assertive, but it was high enough to cut through that rich malt flavor and provide a nice balance. Now, again, to comment on Mecca Grade, they're making really high quality malts, and they do impart what I would describe as a richer malt flavor than, say, Weyermann or other, mass-produced European or continental malts, Pilsner malts, Munich malts, all of that stuff, which I describe as being kind of a drier, toasty flavor. There's this kind of wet richness that I get from Mecca Great Estate malt. And that's just something that, you learn as you use it to how do I want to employ this? And is it going to be different than, if I were using a more traditional malt source?
Yeah, and you have quite a bit of malt. There's over 11.5 pounds of malt in this. So to me, like, that 10.5 of pounds of Pilsner and Munich, when you kind of get that in there with a, 5.7% beer, there's going to be kind of a lot of malt character that comes through, that hopefully isn't going to come across as like sticky, but there's going to be quite a bit. I think if you would have like done like 2 pounds of crystal instead of using your Munich malt, maybe you could have gotten to that kind of like sticky, unpleasant Munich, crystal character that you can get sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think the way your recipe is designed actually kind of works into what you're describing here, which is just a really nice, pleasant beer. Again, I'm like, man, my wife's out. Can I get her to go by the store and get some Alaskan Amber on the way home? What can we get going on here?
Well, a couple things to note before I go over my thoughts overall here is, one, like I said, Tim did come down and drink it. I didn't write up what he thought about it. But he did enjoy it quite a bit. He's a big fan of like Negra Modelo, and to him, he was like, it's not that far off from that. Well, that's technically I would refer to it as kind of a Vienna Munich Dunkel mix style of beer, and this isn't that far off from that. It has a similar characteristic. Now, again, it's fermented with an ale yeast, not a lager yeast. It's fermented a bit warmer than a lager, a bit cooler than your traditional ale, and it is lagered traditionally. But this one wasn't, and it really did seem to hit all of those marks. Now, this recipe was modeled after ones that I've brewed numerous times in the past, so I had some sort of standard by which to compare it. Another note, compared to Alaskan Amber, this was definitely not as sweet. I love Alaskan Amber, but I do perceive it as having a sweetness to it that, it makes it difficult for me to drink more than maybe 2 bottles in one sitting. Now, ultimately, the version that I brewed did have some differences with past batches of alt beer that I made, though certainly not in a negative direction. It's nothing that I would associate with the brewing process per se. Rather, I just perceived certain flavors that I've come to associate with Mecca Great Estate malt that might have been absent had I used more traditional ingredients, continental Pilsner and Munich malt, something from Weyermann, say. But again, I was really pleased with how this alt beer turned out, and I felt that it maintained its stylistic integrity based on the BJCP. Would I have competed with this in the alt beer category? Without a doubt. I might have also thrown it in Munich Dunkel or, something like that as well, maybe European Amber Lager.
Okay, so the important question is, because it's the last 2 questions on all of our short and shoddy surveys, is on a scale of 0 to 5, Marshall, what would you rate this beer as far as to style?
Yeah, we discussed during COVID if we want to go with that and just have the brewer, for the short and shoddy beers, rate them. And we opted against it because I do feel like if anywhere bias is going to come into play, that's it. Since you're asking me, Will,
I'm asking.
I would have. You're demanding.
I'm demanding. The people want to know, Marshall. This is the time.
Here's what I'll say. I'm going to give you I'm going to give you even more than what you asked for, Will, or what you demanded from me. If I were to rate it at how close to the style, how well it represents the style on a scale of 0 to 5, I would probably have given it about a 3.5 to 4. We don't give people the ability to do half ratings, but the reason for that is because I do think that the Mecca Great Estate malt made it taste unique compared to what you might expect if you were walking around the Altstadt in Dusseldorf, Germany. Now, that said, if I were to judge this beer, I don't know if I could have figured out anything in drinking it and smelling it and feeling it in my mouth and doing all of that stuff that would have justified a score lower than about 38. So I would say that in terms of judging, and I am my own worst critic. There's so many beers that I've made that I probably would judge lower than a 30, and I'm very open about that. But in this case, I probably would. It would, if I was judging this blind, I could see myself giving it somewhere between a 38 and a 40 in a BJCP competition. Is that going to win me a gold? Not if there's somebody who scored a 41 or higher, but it may very well have been scored better or worse by other another judging pair. But to me, it just hit the marks, and it was quite good. Very, very crushable, a nice beer to have on tap, like you said, during the nice warm months with my one buddy who I was hanging out with during COVID. So
on the scale of 0 to 5 for how much you enjoyed the beer, taking BJCP guidelines aside, are you rating this a 4 or a 5, or where are you putting it there?
I would go again between a 3 and a 4, only because, again, and that is through the filter of it's an alt beer. It's very difficult for me to separate, knowing what my intentions were from rating my preference. Just as a beer, I would drink this over, 50% of the crap you can find, old in your local grocery store, cooler or whatever. I thought it was a really good drinkable beer. I didn't dump it, drank it happily without complaining about it. But in terms of an alt beer, I would say that I've had better. I think that, was this the best alt beer I've ever made? No, but I don't believe that's necessarily because of the short and shoddy process. As much as I would still have to adapt the recipe just a hair to get it to that drier, toasty flavor, as opposed to that richer, malty flavor.
Yeah, I think if you cut, like you said earlier, if you would have cut down some of the Mecca grade with maybe some continental stuff, just not eliminate it, but cut it, it probably would have had it come out a little bit better. But my favorite test of how good a beer is at home is basically how fast the keg floats, because I've noticed that some of my kegs seem to magically just like have all the beer liberated from it very quickly, whereas others seem to linger on a little bit longer. So was this one that you and Tim kicked a little faster than some of the other ones, or with COVID, was it kind of too hard to tell?
No. I mean, I don't recall necessarily how fast it took, but I would definitely remember if it was one that stuck around longer than usual, and it did not. I remember Tim really enjoying this beer. In fact, he would come over after a day of doing what he did during COVID and just call, hey, is that beer still on tap? He really enjoyed this one. And for those who are wondering, if they're listening to this thinking, I kind of want to give this a shot, the only big change I would make, I'm not even sure I would necessarily recommend using a certain brand of malt that's out there. What I would do is reduce the Munich malt, the Metolius that I used, down to maybe 10% as opposed to 26%. To me, that richness that's probably where that came from. So if that means I need to get color from some other source, that's fine. Maybe add in some carafa like you recommended. It's just that that rich Munich malty flavor was a little bit more present than what I've had in traditional commercial examples of alt beer, and so that's the change I would make. Regardless, this beer turned out really good, and again, no complaints. So we do have a couple reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from Linus De Pauli, who says, alt beer and Kolsch for that matter are fermented at normal ale temperatures, 20°C, in both Cologne and Dusseldorf traditional breweries. The difference is that they are lagered for at least 4 weeks, hence they are called, oh boy, Lager Obergäriges beer in Germany, which translates to top fermented lager beers. There's that oxymoron again. Will, what say you?
Yeah, again, same question. How do we define a lager? Is it the lagering period? Is it the yeast we use? Is it just because we define it as what we wanted to define it as? What is it? What is a rose, if we want to get Shakespearean about it? So I think it's one of those things where it's a lager because we say it is. It's an ale because we say it is. I've had plenty of people serve me West Coast IPA, like Jordan Folks, that uses 3470 in it, and he still calls it an IPA and not West Coast Pils or So there's more to it than just a lagering or a yeast selection. There's obviously some thought behind it. So. But it's cool that there's a German word for it that's that complicated, and I'm not even going to try to say it again because I don't have that note in front of me.
Well, and I can't help but wonder if this comment stemmed from the fact that I used gelatin and was drinking it 4 or 5 days after I kegged it. Yeah, that's kind of the point, Linus, with Short and Shoddy, is trying to expedite this process. And the fact that we enjoyed this beer, I'll tell you this, Will, to kind of respond to a prior question you asked, I can almost guarantee that keg of beer was gone by the time a traditional brewery would still be lagering it before they even got it on tap. So it was good enough done the way it was that we floated that keg within 4 weeks, I'm certain. So the next reader comment comes from Joss, Jass, who said, roasted barley is an absolute no-go in German beers, as this strictly is against Reinheitsgebot. Use chocolate malt instead, and if possible, add it later to the mash in order to avoid too much roasted aroma. I believe this comment, again, in part comes from not understanding what short and shoddy is. We don't really care what's against the Reinheitsgebot. I do appreciate the comment, and I didn't realize until reading this recently, in fact, that the Reinheitsgebot says malted barley, water, hops, and yeast. Well, roasted barley is not malted. So does that go against the Reinheitsgebot? I never even thought about that.
Well, first off, I'm just going to say I'm not sure how much roasted character you got from that. Like, what was it, 2 ounces that you added? Like, you added basically nothing. You weren't getting any flavor. But if we're going to like draw lines in the sand for Reinheitsgebot, what about the gypsum that you added from the start? What about the powdered cow hoof that you added there for clarity? I mean, we can just go down the list. And so to me, as much as I appreciate the Reinheitsgebot as a topical thing that we can talk about, and it's kind of fun to say, and it's interesting, and I kind of agree with a principle behind it. The reality is that I like treating my water. I think that produces better beer. That's against the Reinheitsgebot. I like using finding agents to get my beer clear sooner. That's against the Reinheitsgebot. I like brewing beers that involve sugar, like double IPA and some of those Belgians. Those are all against the Reinheitsgebot. And so to me, I think the Reinheitsgebot's a really fun thing. It's a cool historical thing. I think it's really cool, but it's also not a very applicable thing to anything that I'm doing in modern day brewing. And I think it's crazy that people in Germany were doing things like adding zinc chains into various things to try to get zinc and other minerals in there to help with their yeast health. And so the things that they had to do, like not being able to add acid to the mash and having to use sauergut instead, to me it's crazy to me, like the lengths they had to go to just work around this crazy law for so long. And we talk about it like it's gospel truth. And so I'm kind of interested what his brewing process is today and whether he treats his water or acidifies his mash or any of those things, because those would all be against the Reinheitsgebot.
Yeah, I think it was our friends at Basic Brewing who used to say that Reinheitsgebot's a 4-letter word. I'm cool with that. I love the history of it and all that. And, it really was a taxation thing, is my understanding. Not necessarily, for the sake of the purity of beer. Maybe I'm wrong. But regardless, modernity, we have science, we have better ingredients, and we have a better understanding of the brewing process. And I'm all good with using that. With that said, I think that about covers everything on Altbier and my attempt to brew one using the short and shoddy method. Do you have anything else before we wrap up, Will?
No, I think it's great. In fact, I'm going to go try to find some kind of amber ale somewhere in my house just so I can enjoy one right now.
Well, there is a very popular amber style lager that I know is very close to where you live down there in Texas. Perhaps you can get your hands on some Shinerbach and just tell yourself it's a nice alt beer. I think that'll work, eh?
I could be convinced.
I would grab some if I could. So, well, go please subscribe to The Brulosophy Show over at youtube.com/@TheBrulosophy Show, where Martin's putting together some awesome brewing and beer related content that we're confident you're going to love. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy alt beer. The Brulosophy Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.